They said Bridget Calloway moved through a room like a weather system. You felt her coming before you saw her. Not because she was dramatic, not because she was loud, but because a woman her size, carrying trays through a ballroom full of people who had decided, before she ever opened her mouth, that she didn't belong there, had learned to take up exactly the space she needed, and not 1 inch more. Bridget was 26. She'd been catering events in Montreal since she was 19, working for a company called La Flamme and Associates. White gloves, black aprons, the kind of service that cost more per hour than she made in a shift. She knew how to carry 6 champagne flutes on one tray without a tremor. She knew how to disappear into the wallpaper when the guests got loud and reappear the moment a glass hit empty. She knew how to smile at a man who called her sweetheart while reaching past her for a canapé, the way you smile at weather. It isn't personal, it just is. What she didn't know, on the night of the Beaumont Gala at the Château Laurier in Ottawa, was that the man who had rented the entire east wing of the hotel was not simply a wealthy businessman with a taste for expensive events. His name was Rafael Voss, 41 years old, born in Montreal to a Swiss father and a Quebecoise mother. On paper, CEO of Voss Capital Holdings, a private equity firm with offices in Toronto, Geneva, and Singapore. In reality, and Ottawa had its realities, the kind that moved through government corridors without making appointments. Rafael Voss was the quiet center of a criminal organization that had operated in eastern Canada for over 2 decades. Not the kind with tattoos and motorcycles, the kind with lawyers, the kind that bought properties, moved money, and kept the right people comfortable enough to look the other way. Bridget didn't know any of this when she arrived at 6:15 that evening with the rest of the La Flamme crew. She was thinking about the bus she had to catch at 11:30. She was thinking about the blister forming on her left heel. She was not thinking about Rafael Voss. The event was an engagement party. His younger brother, Theodore, was getting married. A soft-spoken man of 34 who had the look of someone who had spent his entire life standing slightly to the left of someone more important. His fiancée was a woman named Celeste Marchand-Pires. Bridget clocked her the moment she walked in. Celeste was 30, beautiful in the way that required maintenance, dressed in a pale gold gown that probably cost more than Bridget's rent for 4 months. She moved through the room with the confidence of someone who had already decided that everything in it was hers, the chandeliers, the champagne, the people. She had a way of looking at the serving staff that wasn't quite contempt. It was more efficient than that. It was Eresha. The first time Celeste looked at Bridget, she looked through her. The second time, Bridget had just rounded the corner from the kitchen corridor carrying a full tray of oysters on ice when she clipped the edge of a standing flower arrangement. A towering thing of white orchids that the event coordinator had placed precisely 2 inches too far into the path. And the whole tray lurched. Bridget caught it. Not a single oyster moved, but the lurch was enough, and Celeste, who had been standing nearby with a cluster of women in similarly expensive dresses, turned at the sound. "My God," Celeste said, not to Bridget, but to the women around her, in a tone that was almost impressed. "They really will hire anyone." The women laughed, the way women laugh when they're not sure they should, but they're more afraid of the person making the joke than they are of the person it's aimed at. Bridget set the tray down on the nearest surface and went back to the kitchen. She did not cry. She had been not crying at events like this for 7 years. She was very good at it. What she did, standing at the prep counter waiting for the next tray, was notice. Because noticing was something Bridget had always been good at. Better than most people gave her credit for, which was ironic, because the same people who underestimated her were usually the ones she ended up watching most carefully. She noticed, for example, that Rafael Voss had not laughed when Celeste made her remark. He had been standing near the bar 15 feet away, and he had gone very still for a moment, The way a person goes still when they hear something that registers, but that they're choosing, for now, to file rather than address. She noticed that his eyes had moved briefly to her before moving away. She filed this too, the way she filed most things, quietly, without making anything of it. The trouble began around 9 o'clock, when Bridget was making her way through the hallway that connected the ballroom to the smaller salon reserved for family. She was looking for a guest who'd asked for sparkling water, one of the older women at table 6, who'd waved her down with the kind of gentle authority that suggested she wasn't accustomed to waiting, but was too well-mannered to say so. Bridget found her, but not in the ballroom. The woman was in the corridor, standing near the window that looked out over the canal, her evening bag open in her hands, her expression one of total calm bewilderment. She was perhaps 75, small, dressed in deep burgundy, with a pearl brooch at her collar, and she was looking at the contents of her bag with the expression of someone who has opened a book and found that all the words have rearranged themselves into a language they don't recognize. "Can I help you?" Bridget asked, keeping her voice low and even. The woman looked up. "I'm looking for my son," she said. Her name, Bridget would learn later, was Rafael Voss. "He said he'd meet me at the fountain. I can't seem to find the fountain. There was no fountain in the Château Laurier's east wing. There might have been one. Somewhere in the woman's memory at a different hotel, a different event in a different decade." "Of course," Bridget said. "Why don't I take you back to the party? I think he might be looking for you in there." She said it the way you say things to someone whose reality is slightly different from your own, not contradicting, not correcting, just gently redirecting, the way water redirects itself around a stone. Bridget had a grandmother in Rimouski with the same look in her eyes, the same temporary displacement, and she knew that what the woman needed was not to be told she was wrong. She needed to be guided somewhere safe and given a glass of water and sat near someone she recognized. She offered her arm. Rafael Voss took it. They were almost back to the ballroom doors when Celeste appeared. She came from the direction of the salon, moving quickly, and when she saw Marguerite, she stopped. Something crossed her face, irritation, and underneath it, something colder. Then she looked at Bridget. "What are you doing?" "She was in the corridor," Bridget said. "I was bringing her back. She doesn't need to be brought anywhere by the help." Celeste crossed the distance between them in a few sharp steps. "Marguerite, come." Marguerite blinked. She looked at Celeste and then at Bridget, and her grip on Bridget's arm tightened slightly. Not dramatically, just the small involuntary tightening of someone who has made a calculation, however imprecise, about where safety is. "I was looking for the fountain," Marguerite said. "There is no fountain," Celeste said. Her voice had gone thin. "Come, you're embarrassing the family." It was the word embarrassing that did it. Bridget watched Marguerite's face shift, watched the calm bewilderment curdle into something smaller, something ashamed, and she felt the specific anger that lives in the chest, quiet and very warm, the kind that doesn't announce itself. "She wasn't causing any trouble," Bridget said. "She was just a little turned around." Celeste looked at her the way you look at a piece of furniture that has spoken. "I don't remember asking for your opinion." "You didn't," Bridget agreed. "I'm offering it anyway." The silence lasted about 2 seconds, which is a very long time in a hotel corridor. Celeste's chin lifted. "I don't know who you think you are, but you are the hired help at my engagement party. And if you say another word to me, I will have you removed from this building, and I will make sure your company never works an event in this city again." Bridget didn't move. This was the thing about Bridget Calloway that people tended to misread. Her stillness, her size, the way she occupied space. They read it as placidity. They read it as someone who had accepted a position near the bottom of a very long hierarchy and had made her peace with it. They were wrong. What Bridget had made her peace with was something different, with the fact that most battles weren't worth fighting, and that the ones that were worth fighting had to be chosen carefully. She had spent 26 years figuring out which was which. This one was worth it. Her glass is empty, Bridget said. She was looking at Marguerite. Can I get you some water? Marguerite smiled at her. That would be very kind. Celeste Mahand, it happened quickly, the kind of quickly that you replay afterward in slow motion, filling in details you couldn't have registered in real time. Celeste's right hand came up, palm flat, and it was aimed at Marguerite, who had said the wrong thing or looked the wrong way, or simply existed in the wrong space at the wrong moment. And Bridget moved. Not dramatically, not with a shout or a lunge. She simply stepped between them, the way you step in front of a door that someone else is about to walk through, and Celeste's palm connected with Bridget's left shoulder instead. It didn't hurt, exactly. It was more like a statement. Celeste stared at her. I just got between your hand and an elderly woman, Bridget said. Her voice was remarkably calm, even to herself. That's all that happened. The door at the end of the corridor opened. Rafael Voss stood in the doorway for a moment without moving. He had the quality of a man who has spent a great deal of his life assessing rooms and situations before entering them. A stillness that was not passive, but was in fact a form of attention, a kind of listening with the whole body. His eyes moved from Bridget to Celeste to his mother, and then back to Bridget. He crossed the corridor in several long, unhurried strides. Memon! He took his mother's hand from Bridget's arm with a gentleness that was, in the context of everything else Bridget had observed about him that evening, startling. Come! Theodore is asking for you. Marguerite's face softened entirely. Theo is here. He's been looking for you. Raphael guided her a few steps toward the ballroom, and then he paused and looked back over his shoulder. Not at Bridget, at Celeste. Celeste, go back to the party, he said. It was not a suggestion. Celeste opened her mouth, closed it. Her face had gone a particular shade of pale that said she was recalculating several things simultaneously. Raphael, that woman. Go back to the party, Celeste. She went. Marguerite went with the attendant who materialized from somewhere. A quiet woman Bridget hadn't noticed before, who seemed to be specifically tasked with Marguerite's presence at events. Bridget watched them disappear through the ballroom doors and then stood in the corridor alone, her shoulder mildly sore, her tray still in her hand. She wasn't sure what to do with the moment, so she did what she always did. She went back to work. She had collected 2 empty glasses and was heading back toward the kitchen when Rafael Voss fell into step beside her. She almost dropped the glasses. Your name, he said. Calloway. Bridget Calloway. You've worked for La Flamme before. It wasn't a question. Since I was 19. He was quiet for a moment. In another person, the silence might have been calculating. In him, it felt more like the quiet of someone who does not speak more than necessary because they have learned, somewhere along the way, that most of what needs to be communicated can be done without words. What she said to you earlier, he said finally, in the ballroom, when you dropped the tray. Bridget kept walking. I didn't drop the tray. No, he said. You didn't. She stopped. He stopped too, half a step later, and turned to look at her. Up close, Rafael Voss had the kind of face that belonged to a man who had stopped being young at an early age, not because it was lined or worn, but because there was a gravity to it, something settled, like stone that has been in the same place long enough to know the ground beneath it very well. I don't need anything from you, Bridget said. She said it without hostility. It was simply true, and she had learned that the most important things were usually the ones that needed to be said plainly. If that's what this is. He looked at her for a moment. It isn't, then I'm not sure what this is. I'm not entirely sure either, he said, and the honesty of it was so unexpected that Bridget didn't quite know what to do with it. But my mother is inside, and you're the reason she isn't sitting on the floor of a corridor with a stranger while her future daughter-in-law tells her she's a source of embarrassment. So I'm going to stand here for another moment, if that's all right with you. Bridget looked at him. She has dementia. The doctors prefer cognitive decline. The doctors aren't the ones who have to watch her look for fountains that aren't there. Something shifted in his face. No, he said, they're not. She nodded once and started walking again. He didn't follow this time. The gala ended at 11. Bridget was packing up in the kitchen, her feet aching in the specific way that comes from 6 hours of marble flooring, when Rafael Voss appeared in the doorway. He looked embarrassed, which was apparently his default state. He was holding a small envelope. "Miss Calloway," he said, "my brother asked me to give you this." She took it. Inside was a card, hotel stationery, the Château Laurier crest at the top, and on it, in handwriting that was precise without being careful, a phone number and 3 words. "If you're willing." Bridget stood in the Château Laurier kitchen in her black apron with her aching feet and her mild shoulder bruise and looked at those 3 words for a long time. She was not naive. She knew who Rafael Voss was. Not the specifics, not the details, but she had worked enough events in this city to understand the topology of money and power and the various unofficial structures that ran alongside the official ones. She knew that a man like Rafael Voss did not pass his personal number through his brother to a catering employee without understanding exactly what he was doing. She also knew that he had not followed her down the corridor. She folded the card and put it in her pocket and went to catch her bus. She called 3 days later, not because she'd decided anything, but because she'd found herself thinking about the way he'd taken his mother's hand. They met at a cafe on Elgin Street, neutral ground, public, her choice of location, which she suspected he'd done deliberately. He was already there when she arrived, which meant he had arrived first, which meant he was someone who arrived first to things and then waited without impatience. She filed this. He bought her coffee and did not comment on her order. He asked her how long she'd been in Ottawa, and she told him she'd come down from Montreal 3 years ago for a job that had since disappeared, and had stayed because the city had grown on her, in the way cities do when you start knowing which bus goes where. He listened. He was, she discovered, a very good listener, not in the performative way of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but in the way of someone who has learned that most information arrives in the space between words if you're quiet enough to catch it. She asked him what he actually did. He told her what he told most people: the private equity firm, the holdings, the offices. She looked at him across the table and said, "That's the version." His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "What version would you like? An honest one?" He was quiet for a moment. "Honest is complicated." "Most things are," Bridget said. "I'm asking anyway." He told her more than he'd intended to. She suspected. Not everything. She didn't expect everything. But enough that his organization existed on the edges of legality, that it had for a long time, that he had inherited as much as built it, and that he had spent 20 years maintaining something that he was not entirely certain he would build again if he could start from the beginning, but that he did not know how to stop. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you asked." People don't usually just answer. "No," he agreed. "They don't." She stirred her coffee. Outside on Elgin Street, the Ottawa autumn was doing what it did in October. Cold light, clean air, the smell of something ending. "I'm not going to pretend to be comfortable with any of that," she said. "I know, and I'm not." She stopped. "I'm not someone who fits into whatever world you operate in. I work catering events. I take the bus. I have $700 in savings and a very small apartment on Rideau Street. I know that, too." "Then why?" "Because," he said, and he said it with the same settled certainty she'd heard in his corridor voice, the one that didn't raise itself to be believed. "You stood between Celeste's hand and my mother, and you did it without thinking about what it would cost you. And I have been around people my entire adult life who calculate everything before they do it and I had forgotten what the other thing looked like. Bridget looked at her coffee. "That's a lot of weight to put on one moment," she said. "Maybe," he said. "But I've learned to trust the moments." What followed was not simple. Nothing involving Rafael Voss was simple, and Bridget had always been a person who understood this about the world. That the things worth having were rarely the ones that arrived already assembled. She did not move in his world, and he did not pretend she should. He did not bring her to the events where she would be catalogued and assessed, and found wanting by the same calculus that Celeste Marchand-Pires had applied in that corridor. When they were together, they were mostly together the way regular people are together: coffee on Elgin Street, dinner at places with paper napkins and menus written on chalkboards, walks along the canal in the November cold where their breath came out in clouds, and he told her things about his mother's illness that he hadn't said out loud to anyone else. Marguerite, he told her, had started declining 2 years ago. It had been slow at first, small lapses, misplaced words, the fountain she was always looking for, which turned out to be real, a fountain in the courtyard of a hotel in Geneva where she had spent her honeymoon. It had accelerated in the last 6 months. Celeste had not known about the dementia before the engagement, or she had known and had not understood the extent of it. Either way, she had since made clear, in the polished way that certain people make things clear without ever saying them directly, that Marguerite was a complication she hadn't signed on for. Theodore had not told his brother any of this. Theodore, who had been standing slightly to the left of someone more important his entire life, had learned to absorb things rather than report them. Raphael had found out the night of the gala. Not from Theodore. From Bridget Calloway, who had been in the corridor at exactly the wrong time for everyone except Marguerite Voss. December arrived, and with it the specific quality of Ottawa cold that feels personal, the wind off the river that finds the gaps in your coat, the ice that forms on the canal overnight and makes the morning commute a test of character. Bridget had worked 3 more La Flamme events and had started picking up shifts at a hotel downtown, and she and Raphael had settled into something that neither of them had named yet, which was probably wise. Then Celeste phoned. Bridget didn't know she had her number until her phone rang on a Wednesday afternoon, and the voice on the other end was measured and precise, and very cold. "I want to talk to you," Celeste said, "about Raphael." Bridget sat down on her couch. "I'm listening. He's not what you think he is." "I know what he is," Bridget said, "better than you might expect." A pause. "He told you. He told me some things." "Then you understand," Celeste said, "that whatever this is, whatever he's made you believe this is, it isn't real. Men like Raphael don't build lives with women like you. They find them interesting for a season, and then they move on. And when they move on, the woman left behind is," another pause, "unprotected." Bridget was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, the canal was frozen solid, grey-white under the December sky. "I appreciate the concern," she said finally, "but I don't think that's really what you're calling about." Silence. "The engagement is off," Bridget continued. "Isn't it? Or it's about to be." More silence, which was its own kind of answer. If Raphael made a decision about his brother's engagement, Bridget said carefully, "That decision is between him and Theodore. It has nothing to do with me." "You were there," Celeste said. "You told him?" "I didn't tell him anything," Bridget said. "I was in a corridor. Things happened. He saw them." The line was quiet for a long time. "You think you're different," Celeste said. Her voice had changed, lost some of its precision, gone somewhere rawer. "You think he looks at you and sees something he doesn't see anywhere else. Maybe he does right now. But you're a catering employee, Bridget. You live on Rideau Street. In 6 months, Celeste," Bridget said. "I grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Pointe St. Charles with my mother and my grandmother, and not quite enough of anything. I've been told my whole life what I am and what I'm not, and what I'm worth and what I should expect from the world. I don't need another person to do that. I'm genuinely asking you to stop." There was a long silence. "He's going to hurt you," Celeste said finally, and for the first time she meant it like she meant it in a different way than she had before. Not as a threat, but as something else. Something that might have been real concern buried under a great deal of other things. "Maybe," Bridget said. "But that's mine to figure out." She ended the call. She sat on her couch for a while with the phone in her hands and the canal grey-white outside the window and the specific Ottawa cold pressing at the glass. Then she called Rafael. "I think you should come over," she said. "There are things we should probably talk about." He arrived 40 minutes later with takeout from the Vietnamese place on Somerset Street because he had learned, in the month since the gala, that Bridget Calloway thought better when her hands were occupied with something, and food was a reasonable something. They talked for 3 hours. Not about Celeste, not mostly. About what his life looked like from the inside, about what she needed, not from him specifically, but in general, as a person who had been building her own stability out of thin materials for a long time and was not prepared to trade it for something that might not hold. About what he was, and wasn't able to promise, and what she was, and wasn't willing to accept, and the distance between those two sets of things, and whether the distance was workable. It was not a romantic conversation, exactly, but it was an honest one. And Bridget had learned, somewhere in the years of working events where people performed their lives at each other across rooms full of flowers and champagne, that honest conversations were rarer and more valuable than romantic ones. "I'm not going to ask you to change what you are," she said, somewhere around midnight, when the takeout containers were empty and the canal was invisible in the dark. "I can't live in the middle of it, but I'm not going to pretend it doesn't exist either." He nodded. "And the thing with Theodore," she said. "That's not because of me." "No," he said. "It's not. Is he?" "He's all right. He's upset, but he'll be all right." He knew. He looked out the window. "I think part of him was hoping someone would say it. And your mother. My mother liked you," he said. "She asked about the nice girl from the fountain." Bridget laughed, which surprised her. It surprised him too. She could see it, the way his face did the small thing it did when something reached him through the careful arrangement he kept around himself. "She thought I was at the fountain?" Bridget said. "You were taking her to the fountain," he said. "In her version of the night, you found her and you took her where she was trying to go." Bridget was quiet for a moment. "I like her version," she said finally. "So do I," said Rafael Voss. Outside, the Ottawa night was very cold and very still, and the canal lay under the ice, moving underneath in the way that rivers move in winter, patient and invisible and going on regardless, the way most real things do. Bridget Calloway had not fixed anything that evening. She had not resolved anything cleanly or received any guarantees or arrived at a place where the map was clear. She was 26, and her shoulder still had a faint bruise that was turning from purple to yellow, and she had $700 in savings and a small apartment on Rideau Street. But she had stood in a corridor and done the right thing without calculating the cost, and somehow that one moment had set in motion everything else. The coffee on Elgin Street, the walks along the canal, the 3-hour conversation over Vietnamese takeout, the man sitting across from her now who had spent 20 years learning not to trust things and was, against his better judgment, beginning to unlearn it. Some things begin the way the river begins, miles from where you're standing, in a place you'll never see. And some things begin because a woman who knows how to carry a tray without spilling it decides, on an ordinary night in an ordinary corridor, that she is not going to move.